Hi, and welcome to the turbulent world with me, James M. Dorsey, as your host. Libya has figured prominently in recent headlines. These days, it's floods that have devastated Eastern Libya and killed as many as 2,000 people, days after a catastrophic earthquake rocked Morocco. Like much else, what starts in Libya doesn't stay in Libya. It reverberates far beyond the North African country's borders. With two rival governments, both supported by external players, Libya has been in turmoil since the 2011 popular Arab revolt that toppled Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Each of the rival governments is supported by external players. Eastern Libya is controlled by rebel leader Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, while Western Libya is governed by an internationally recognized government in Tripoli. The floods could not have occurred at a worse moment for Haftar. The short-lived mutiny in June by the Wagner Group has cast a shadow over Russian backing for the rebel leader. Add to this recent protests following a controversial meeting in Rome between the foreign ministers of Libya and Israel. The protests raised the specter of a disconnect between Middle Eastern governments and public opinion as the United States seeks to engineer the establishment of diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Libya, alongside Algeria, Syria, and Lebanon, may be the least likely candidate to normalize its relations with Israel, in part because of the influence of Islamists and militants in a country that is as much ruled by rival governments as it is by militias. Overall, Libya may not be the most influential player in the Middle East, but the impact of what happens in Libya resonates across the region and beyond, frequently impacting the domestic policies of countries like the United States, France, and Italy. My guest today, Ethan Chorin, notes that Libya, if ignored, may be marginal for policy formation, but it's poisonous when neglected. A former U.S. diplomat who served in Libya and elsewhere in the Middle East, Ethan is the author of Benghazi, a new history of the fiasco that pushed America and its world to the brink. Because he did not have bodyguards, Ethan skipped a dinner a decade ago with U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens at the U.S. consulate in Benghazi. Mr. Stevens and 3 other Americans were killed that night in an attack by Islamic militants on the consulate. Republicans in the United States targeted then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for her handling of the attack, making it a major issue in the 2016 presidential election, in which she lost to Donald Trump. Ethan, welcome to the turbulent world. It's great to have you on the show.
Yes, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. It's a turbulent world indeed.
Absolutely. And I'm tempted to kick off with the attack on the consulate a decade ago, but let's start with the floods that swept Eastern Libya in recent days. The internationally recognized government in Tripoli that has fought military battles with Haftar, who is backed by countries like Russia and the United Arab Emirates, has rushed emergency aid to the region. Is this likely to be a one-off, or could it reshape Libya's political landscape? How much of this could be determined by who controls rescue and reconstruction efforts, as well as the flow of aid?
Well, first of all, this is an unprecedented catastrophe in Libya, natural catastrophe. I think the estimates at this point of how many people have been killed are pushing upwards of potentially 10,000 or more. Derna, the city that has been most devastated, was hit essentially by a tsunami that 30-meter. According to some reports, 30-meter high wall of water that rushed onto the wadi area there after the collapse of a dam that was built in the 1970s and hadn't been properly repaired. So something like a third to a quarter of the city has just simply been wiped away. So this is a desperate, like the Morocco quake, a desperate humanitarian issue. I'm not sure about how much aid has actually been sent from Tripoli. There have been reports of that in fact some aid has been turned back. Whether that's accurate or not, who knows? But I don't think that the Tripoli government has the capacity at this point to deal with this magnitude of a disaster.
So what does this mean politically? With other words, if you have basically two rival governments, neither of which can come to the aid of what is a disaster indeed. It's not just a tsunami, it's a breaking of two dams. And the reports, as you clearly mentioned, that some 10,000 people have not been accounted for. What does this mean? What's the political fallout of that?
Well, that's unclear. I think there's more likely to be recriminations from the local population about the continuation of the feeling of neglect and conflict with the Western government. I don't see this as being a something that could necessarily bring the country together in the immediate term, unless there's what we need right now is international assistance on a massive scale. The political issues are, I think that the trend at this point is increasingly becoming a division between East and West. And the question is not so much political unity as how to distribute resources effectively. I've written a piece recently that argued that this extended effort to try to force parties that are ideologically and otherwise oil and water is not going to wind up with a coherent. It's not going to end well.
I want to come back to the future and whether or not unity is possible and so on. But let's stick for just one moment with something you just said about the fallout of the flood. So people in Eastern Libya who are in desperate need of assistance are not getting it. Who are they going to blame in the first place? Is that going to be the government or Haftar's government in Benghazi or and in Tobruk, or is that going to be the government, the internationally recognized government in Tripoli?
I think there's a lot of blame to go all around. You could look at this as the natural result of a failed international intervention back in 2011. The political fighting and endless reconstituted governments, etc., and a tradition whereby the East feels, rightly so, in many ways, that the power center in the West has ignored and starved them of resources. There are two dams that failed one after the other. But the main larger one has not been repaired apparently since 2002. And I've heard that various parts, pumps related to the dam, sensors have been essentially looted, by who knows exactly whom. And the dam is, essentially there were advanced concerns expressed locally that the dam might indeed break. Clearly, there's going to be some local recriminations as well. But I see this as being, it's an opportunity for the international community to express some real concern about the state of, to do something tangible and practical. There are very specific needs at the moment for medicine, shelter. All of the roads except one into Derna have been severed. This is going to require an enormous efforts, and disasters do tend to bring people together to some degree. In this case, whether it has some sort of a positive political impact on the country as a whole, I kind of doubt it. I think it will exacerbate ultimately the division between East and Western governments.
And the problem, of course, with an international response is that you already have a massive need in Morocco, and it's going to be tough on the international community to address two of these crises of such magnitude simultaneously.
Yes, the Moroccan quake is an absolute disaster, obviously, and it took a while for the international media to pick up on what was going on in Eastern Libya, partly because communications have been out, and the attention has not been so much on Libya. Information is scarcer. But the scale of the disaster in Libya could exceed some of the worst estimates at this point. Derna is a town of officially 80,000 people, but the numbers are closer to 110, 120, and conservative estimates suggest that at least 10% of the population has just been washed out to sea.
Right. I mean, this comes to
all of the effects on the rest of Eastern Libya. And you have, neighboring countries. Greece is also dealing with some of the aftermath of this storm, and the Libyans just simply were not prepared to cope with something like this.
And all of this comes at a moment of uncertainty for Khalifa Haftar, particularly after the death of the Wagner Group's commander Yevgeny Prigozhin in a plane crash in Russia last month. Russian Deputy Defense Minister Yunus Ben-Yukharov was quick to visit Haftar in Benghazi amid uncertainty about the future of the relationship. What does that have on, what kind of an impact does that have on Haftar's positioning, particularly in the wake of the flood and the description that you just gave about previous warnings that the dams could break?
Well, I don't see this as being, I think the Wagner Group is, by all accounts, still very present in Benghazi. I don't see that, and that's been an issue for some time. I think the Western government and Prime Minister Beba are probably they're experiencing their own pressures related to the event that you alluded to earlier, this fiasco related to the U.S. to the leaking of a clandestine contact between the foreign ministers of the Western government of national unity and the Israeli foreign minister in Rome, which also connects to, as does the Haftar Wagner situation, to Libyan perceptions of what the Americans are thinking and how to manage that relationship. Clearly, the Americans would like there to be, as Libya to be as separate from Russia as possible.
Maybe this is a good moment to take a step back, and you can tell us how Libya, after the 2011 popular revolt that toppled Muammar Gaddafi, got to where it is today. Or maybe we even have to go back further in time, to the 2001 September 11 Al-Qaeda attacks on New York and Washington.
Yes, this is a tough question to answer, and it's a critical one, because I think that, as you mentioned, I just wrote a book about the antecedents and consequences of the Benghazi attack in 2012 on U.S. foreign policy and domestic politics. That subject has become so taboo that essentially you can't touch it without getting an immediate partisan sort of regurgitation on either side. So, but it was, as you also alluded to, had a substantial, if not decisive, impact on the 2016 elections, as well as America's general sort of increased risk aversion across the board in the region. And it does go back to 9/11. The attack in Benghazi was clearly, I mean, this point has been sort of dodged or for political reasons. But the attack in Benghazi was clearly the work of Al-Qaeda. There's quite a bit of evidence that suggests that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Al-Qaeda head, was aware of it, and that it may have been linked to other attacks around the same time. The mechanics of that are complicated. I and a couple of other authors have gone into this in some detail, but clearly it's the Benghazi attack and the situation in Libya, it has been conditioned by the 9/11 attacks and the U.S. Response to them, which passes through the U.S. relationship with past relationship with radical Islamists who were both clients and enemies at various times over the last two to 3 decades, and General Haftar, or Field Marshal Haftar, who has also been both a client and a somewhat ostracized by the U.S. and the international community. So what we're seeing today in Libya is a product of a series of co-optations and attempts to contain a situation that at one point was manageable, but now has become so complicated, so convoluted, that one can't see how it can be put together in any way that affords it a political legitimacy required for durability. And without reverting to outright dictatorship or autocracy. The only real approach that I can see is to approach this from a bottom-up reconstruction posture rather than a top-down, dictation by international diktat that this is the government that Libyans need. And the elections are a problem, currently are a real problem, because none of the major figures in power right now have any real interest in elections, because they're polling miserably on all sides. So nobody wants to let go of power, and the divisions are bitter.
Yeah. We'll probably come back to that a little bit later. Just for clarity reasons, when you say the United States at one point worked with radical Islamists, I assume you're talking about about Afghanistan and the anti-Soviet jihad.
Well, that was the first point of contact, and then once there was the 2003 rapprochement between the U.S. and Libya, which involved basically rehabilitating Gaddafi in order to largely fit the narrative of democracy promotion and some sort of positive knock-on effect from the Iraq War, when things were going horribly there. The U.S. wanted all sorts of things from Gaddafi, but one of them was a model reform process in which we were not particularly invested. But both Gaddafi and the United States, to some degree, well, Gaddafi certainly realized that his major enemies were the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which had been trying to kill him since the early 90s, and that he had this major radical Islamist issue and opposition from the Muslim Brotherhood, primarily located in the east. So, in any case, the U.S., in order to essentially help prop up the Gaddafi government, the U.S. And advance the cause of the war on terror, the United States and the UK, and with help from other countries, went and essentially kidnapped and rendered the senior membership of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which was time allied with Al-Qaeda, back to Libya for what was termed a review process, Rajat, in which they would publicly, the goal was to get them to publicly renounce their association with Al-Qaeda and commit to democratic processes. So they went from essentially being occasional allies against Gaddafi to potential to then enemies of the state to then potential allies in essentially preserving a fragile status quo under Gaddafi. Nobody at the time predicted the Arab Spring, which essentially opened up the field to all players, and certainly the Islamist parties and organizations were far more prepared to negotiate that process and benefit from it than any so-called not secular but non-religiously focused ideological non-ideological party. So essentially, the attack on the Benghazi mission was really an effort to, I believe, a part of a broader effort to destabilize a country that was rapidly destabilizing, given the political vacuum that was created by the U.S. NATO international intervention. We essentially left the country without. We encouraged democracy promotion, but did very little to try to build to engage in state building. So essentially, we replicated the mistake of Iraq, thinking that we being the United States, thinking that the Europeans were going to come in and pick up the pieces, but they of course operate on political cycles as well, and did not have the capacity or the political will to help put Libya back together again. So you have a huge missed opportunity there. As an aside, I felt that the revolution was a very positive, even though I did not agree with the mission creep as Secretary Gates predicted, and the toppling of Gaddafi in the way that he was. I think that the Libyan people deserve a much better government than they had at that point, and there was an opportunity to actually help remake the country, but the needs were very specific and very deep, and they simply were not addressed.
Indeed, that seems to be a repeating pattern in U.S. policy, or in Western European policy too, of not following through.
But as you mentioned before, the consequences were enormous, and I don't actually think that the American public or the public at large in Europe, for example, understands just how catastrophic bungling the Libya has been. Look at coups in Mali and Niger, arms movements from across the Sahel into the Sinai, and support for radical groups in Syria, and it basically shaped and conditioned the Obama administration's approach to foreign policy, away from tricky problems that would enable the American right to essentially take free fall potshots at that. So everything became extremely cautious. And I think that has become a real liability with respect to U.S. policy.
You Justin, I'd like you to expand on that. I think if I understood you correctly, implicitly we're saying that the destabilization of Libya contributed to the destabilization of West Africa, if you wish, with what we've seen, about 7 coups in 3 years across the region, most recently in Niger and in Gabon. Tell us a little bit more how Libya played into that, and the destabilization of Libya played into that.
Well, of course, there's a whole dynamic in Libya's south with respect to the Tubu and the Tuareg, who have political connections in all of those countries.
Tuareg is a tribe that is crosses a number of borders in the region.
Right. So there are long-standing enmities along the border there, And with the and of course, many of these states have been facing their own in the Sahel, they're facing long, protracted warfare against Islamists of various flavors, and most obviously the decade-long Algerian war, etc. But with the intervention, essentially, Libya became a looting ground for weapons that essentially supercharged all of these conflicts as various groups fled Libya into these countries and essentially helped create opposition groups or empowered opposition groups that the perturbations of which are many, but essentially, I don't think there's any real doubt that without the Libyan situation, the political implosion of Libya became, or the ouster of Gaddafi became a torch for the Sahel. Various French intelligence reports that were published afterward were very clear that if Gaddafi goes, their problems would increase exponentially.
We both alluded to the meeting between the Israeli and the Libyan foreign ministers in Rome recently, and as mentioned before, Libya seems to be one of the most unlikely candidates for engagement with Israel. What do you see as the reason for the meeting, and how much is this potentially driven by wanting to earn brownie points in Washington? And what are the domestic drivers here?
Well, I think as you put it, certainly the most current or prevalent view is just that the government of in Libya's west was looking for the government of national unity, recognized by the international community, was looking for brownie points with the United States in terms of advancing the Arab-Israeli peace process that was energized, however you want to put it, by the Abraham Accords of 2020. There has been a current of both Israeli Jews of Libyan origin and some in Libya for contacts that date back to the Gaddafi times. But I think it was just a botched effort on all sides, and I believe that the Israelis did not actually think that that this meeting was going to turn into anything, because Libya is not in a position to negotiate anything at the moment, given its political divisions and fragility, and the fact that its government, who knows how long it's going to last. I think that was that a calculation was made in Jerusalem that the better to take some bird in the hand and claim credit for the meeting than actually invest in some kind of real process. So, and the question of whether the Israeli media has been full of also recriminations about who and why, and would this affect the peace process, the respected peace process with Saudi Arabia, etc. I think it's basically a red herring with respect to Saudi Arabia. The calculations are very different, and everybody can sort of see what's happening in Libya and why this would come up, but it doesn't reflect well on anyone. So,
obviously, the 2012 attack on the consulate in which Ambassador Stevens was killed was a watershed moment for Libya. But it also left an indelible mark on the United States and on European countries. And you alluded to that earlier, but I wonder whether you could spell what that mark is and how that mark continues to exist until today. If you could expand on that in greater detail.
Yes, well, the Benghazi attack certainly left a huge mark, not only on Libya and many of the neighboring countries in terms of their level of political chaos, and disunity. It was a watershed moment in American political history. That fact, I think, has been obscured by the very politicization of that event back home in the United States. Benghazi became a taboo subject and was characterized or summarized on both sides, selectively picked information and created their own two narratives, some of which was true and much of it which was false. And the American public became so incredibly turned off of the whole issue that one can't, even 10 years later, really penetrate that shell and explain to what degree Benghazi essentially served as a kindling for a step up in American polarization and ultimately the election of Donald Trump. Benghazi, more than, it's interesting. There have been a couple of new sort of reflections on the Trump presidency, and it's quite shocking to me that Benghazi is never mentioned as a factor in that outcome, because all of the senior officials on both sides of the aisle that I interviewed for my book on the broader impact of Benghazi have said very openly that regardless of what's been said in the media, Benghazi was the issue that decided the 2016 election, simply because it was the common denominator of every other issue that's been cited as a major factor in the 2016 election. And all of that goes back to 9/11 and the circumstances in which the Obama administration was born, which was highly conditioned by the Iraq War and the war on terror, and it had to create a narrative against that. And there was a constant fear within the Democratic Party that they were, and rightly so, that the Republicans would come back and use anything that looked like it might indicate a resurgence of Al-Qaeda or a failure of the war on terror against them. And I think that as I explain in the book, I think the punchline here is that the Republicans were looking for a fight, and the Democrats were looking to escape from a fight. And by doing that, essentially made the administration made the problem that could have been managed worse. Although I'm not blaming, I try very hard in this book not to assign not to be a partisan force, but to explain the mechanics. How did this happen, and what do we not know about the Benghazi situation? Everybody has an opinion, but most of them are simply incorrect. I was on the ground. I was
going to say this was for you also a personal issue. You were in Benghazi. Ambassador Stevens was a friend of yours. You were supposed to be at dinner in the consulate at the moment of the attack, and at the last minute decided not to go. So this is not just something you're looking at from afar. It's also something very personal for you.
Yes, and when I came back, I waited and took us a day and a half to get out of Benghazi. I was no longer a U.S. official. I was working on a medical infrastructure project. And when I finally got back to the United States, a week later, I got a call as my plane was landing from the Wall Street Journal asking me to comment on a video. And I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. This, of course, was the anti-Islamic video that was cited as the proximate cause of the.
This was a burning. If I can recall correctly, it was a burning of a Quran, possibly in Florida. Correct?
It was just there was a loose connection with the person who behind that. But it was a video created by an Egyptian American in Los Angeles that basically didn't go anywhere, but then was dubbed into Arabic a few days before 9/11. And as I also explain in the book, I think that was a purposeful attempt to rile up the public before 9/11. So the video did play a role in the Benghazi attack and the other protests around the Islamic world. but it was not not in the way that the media and the administration claimed, or even the Republicans.
Right. If you look back, what lessons do you think should be learned from the attack?
Well, this I think basically one problem is these are historical problems with the U.S. foreign policy, that we tend to have a very short attention span. We don't invest because of our own domestic political problems. We don't, the Foreign Service and other professional bureaucracies don't get the funding and the attention they deserve. They've become polarized. I think the Iraq War started. This didn't originate with the Iraq War, but I think there was a step function up in political manipulation of data on the organizational level that just continued. So it's not so these things. It's like the example I give is the major universities in the U.S. You decimate the top 10% of your faculty, and you no longer have a prestigious university. You've got so this is what's facing the United States is, and Secretary Blinken said as much just before he took office as secretary, that he was speaking specifically about the Trump administration, saying that the Foreign Service was essentially, Trump opened the door and let a whole bunch of people out, and that it would take 2 decades to repair the damage. But the problem is that process has been going on for far longer than the Trump administration. Trump was more like a very active symptom of the problem. So I think the lessons are that it's not just the threats to democracy come in various guises, and one is one has to have an independent, somewhat transparent and factful foreign policy and security community that shares information. These are the same lessons that from 9/11 essentially. And that, essentially we can't do half measures. We can't go and, there's a happy medium, I don't know, probably an unhappy medium here between outright intervention and doing nothing. And in the case of Libya, we intervened in a country that had promising prospects. Many of the points that were articulated by people, including Ambassador Stevens, as to why we should help in Benghazi back in 2011, remain valid today. Low population, high wealth, lack of overt sectarian divides. Of course, this has now been taken over by a multitude of sort of quasi-tribal and military and criminal activities. When you take away the center or the structure, as dysfunctional as it was in Libya, dysfunctional and functional as they were in Libya and Iraq, you have to create something to replace it, or else you have people revert to the lowest common denominator to survive. So I think there are a lot of lessons there. Of course, it also touches on electoral reform in the United States, that we've got a system that simply doesn't function properly, and is subjected to wild swings based on ideology, not reality. And this is, of course, a global phenomenon, so it's not just limited to the States. As I mentioned in the book, there's a huge impact also on the timing of the development of certain aspects of social media and the Benghazi attack. That I actually interviewed a number of experts on sort of the evolution of social media, and they all point to that one period just around the attack on the mission in Benghazi as the time frame in which social media could become weaponized and turn and actively be exploited by other countries and people in the United States to put people into to extremes. And I guess the broader point is, if you look at the history of the United States since the September 11th, the original Al-Qaeda attack, I don't think that bin Laden and his deputies could ever imagine in their wildest dreams they could do as much damage as they have done to the United States by essentially creating not just external harm or internal specific destruction, but ideological conflict within the United States. And that point has been made in a couple of op-eds, but I don't think that the general public understands just how successful the baiting of the Bush administration on ideological grounds, and the Bush, contributed to America's current problems. And I say that essentially Benghazi has really shaped the world we live in today, just as much as the original 9/11 did. But we're not going to learn any lessons until we learn that, until we understand that.
Indeed. But what you're basically saying is that Benghazi is one of the first examples of the impact of manipulation on social media. Is that correct?
Yes, I do. It is. I think it is I think I called it one of the original social media scandals. Without social media, it's sort of like you can look back at other points in the development of the internet and media technology, and how it's surprised presidents and officials in the past. A number of studies have been done in Italy on this issue as well. I got much of the information from a number of Italian data scientists who were working on this question of how a polarization in Italian politics as linked to specific advances in social media.
I think it would be interesting if you could sort of spell out a little bit more in the case, sort of as a case study in the case of Benghazi, who did what to whom on social media.
Here, or I have done so in my book, but social media. I think if you look at the there are several books that actually go through in minute detail the portrayal of Hillary Clinton on social media and the effect of memes and the bots that propagated those memes and the connections with foreign powers and the political parties within the United States.
Foreign powers like?
Well, the Russians, for one. Essentially America was exposed, and not enough people, while I think a number of individuals in the Obama administration realized just how toxic the situation was becoming, and were putting more and more resources into defenses, which is part of the problem. You can't blame on some level, you can't blame the Obama administration for having to create these structures to defend against attack, because that was a reality at the time and getting worse. On the other hand, that preoccupation led them into other situations from which were essentially very harmful to the administration's legacy, or hoped for legacy. If that makes sense.
No, it certainly does. I guess finally, Libya is a fractured country, and in many ways an artificial country. It's also a country in which both nonviolent Islamists and jihadists play an important role on both sides of the divide. How problematic is the role of, on the one hand, the nonviolent Islamists, on the other, the jihadists, as well as the role of foreign powers like Russia, the UAE, and Turkey that have lined up behind one or the other rival in Libya? And does Libya at all have a future as a unified country?
That's 5 questions in one. I think first of all, on the Islamist question, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and I think it also comes to the heart of, like, the United States really didn't understand who was who in Libya, just as it didn't understand who was who when the U.S. embassies in Tanzania and Kenya were bombed back in 1998, which had a Libya connection, by the way. Differences between, sorry?
I said I didn't realize that.
Yes, the Libyans were, for very specific reasons, I think seen by the Al-Qaeda senior leadership as a prime pool from which to recruit. They were exiled from their country. Gaddafi was hot on their tails, and they were very keen on going back and getting rid of the regime. So they were very, very highly motivated. But the connections between, there's a long, this goes back to this sort of the etymology of Islamist groups and their offshoots, transitions and manipulations by other powers. So all of this stuff, as I alluded to, as I mentioned before, the United States flirtation with some of these groups sort of opened and lack of consistent attention to what was going on in Libya and the connections between these groups and other groups along the spectrum of Islamism, political Islam, made us essentially sitting ducks. And everyone in the region knew that if you attack the United States, dating back to the 1983 bombing of the U.S. barracks and Marine barracks in Beirut, the U.S. will leave. And when I was standing on the tarmac in Benghazi, hoping to get on the last flight out after the attack, I was thinking just this, that the United States should not leave. The instinct is going to be to leave Benghazi, but this should not be the case. This is an opportunity to, because not to emphasize the current situation, the dam would break. And as far as I think you were alluding to the madkhalis,
I was referring to, on the one hand, let's say, nonviolent Islamists. I'm not sure I would define the madkhalis. Just to be clear, the madkhalis are followers of a very prominent Saudi cleric who is a quietist. With other words, he does not favor engagement in politics, but he does preach absolute obedience to the ruler. And madkhalis have played a major role in Benghazi within the militia of Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar, and so
they're also they're playing both sides. The madkhalis have a very strong presence within the deterrence force special deterrence force that's part of the apparatus in Tripoli, and their allegiances shift back and forth according to, sort of very, very generally speaking, who's got the power. Right. What they don't do is advocate. They were originally against the intervention, the intervention in Libya, and therefore, ostensibly, they are Salafists in the true sense of the word, but they are for the maintenance of power for the greater good, regardless of whether the power is just or not.
Absolutely. So my question was twofold. One is, I was making a distinction between non-violent Islamists and violent Islamists, who usually are jihadists. And so my question was, how much of a role do both the non-violent Islamists as well as the jihadists play in Libya, and how problematic is that? And then the second part of that question was essentially the same for the foreign powers, Russia, the United States, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, that have lined up both behind either Haftar or the government in Tripoli.
Okay, for the first question, the Islamist question is central to the evolution of the Libya problem. As you mentioned, the Benghazi attack was just sort of the manifestation of a degree of influence that would only increase after the U.S. and other parties left Benghazi, and they are present in every facet of the political situation in their various guises, whether madkhalis or quietists or strategic strategists or or the Muslim Brotherhood. The question of political Islam has been present in Libya for a long time, obviously, and the major source was Egypt since the years of Nasser, when many of the Brotherhood leaders fled to Libya for sanctuary. But it's complicated because obviously the original for a couple of centuries, the main Islamist current in a very conservative country that is Libya was the Senussia, which is a Sufi order, which many of these groups see as heretical or apostasy. So these conflicts are rife. The question is, how much has the intervention in 2011 changed the nature of Libyan society? You're not. One point that I make quite frequently is that given the demographics of Libya and the fact that in 2011 I think 70% of the population was under the age of 30. You've got a whole huge generation of people for whom Gaddafi was not the main figure in their conscious lives, and have been influenced by a variety of ideologies that were not endemic to Libya. Now, that's a historical process, and you can say, okay, that we have to deal with the reality as it is now. But it requires thought and an understanding of these dynamics, which I think is one of the problems with the West. Is the West, generally speaking, I would describe their treatment of Libya as one of containment rather than understanding of these dynamics. Make sure that the migrants don't make it to the shores of Europe, and make sure that the terrorism doesn't spread. And as far as the outside powers like Turkey, the Emirates, etc., all of them have their regional interests. And regardless of what you think of them and their validity, they're advancing they each have their own logic. The Gulf states are, particularly Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are working against what they perceive to be radical Islamist takeover. And Turkey and its allies look at Libya as an opportunity to expand their reach to a former Ottoman territory and lay claim to economically viable assets. So Libya has become a proxy battleground. But the threats, are clear. I think that's and the question, of course, becomes, how do you disentangle all of these elements, which just and then you have the international community coming in and essentially picking and choosing among governments, and we'll take a bit of the elected constituencies here and merge them with an appointed group here, and hopefully we'll have something that'll work. Just simply compounds the problem, because you've lost any thread of legitimacy. So where do you go at the moment? Where do you go? I mean, everybody keeps saying, "Oh, the elections are going to come soon," but I don't see that happening anytime soon. It's become absent a real sort of radical act, as in an occupation or some other unforeseen circumstance. How you deal with this is a major. I think that's why the international community isn't precisely engaged in this policy of containment. They don't want, as with Gaddafi. You mentioned the question of whether Libya, Libya's history as a state. You also have to realize that Libya is a very young state, and the other metaphor that I really like in trying to understand Libya and its dynamics is the notion of Libya as a vast sand sea upon which there are islands, small islands and populations, mostly along the coast, all of which have their own individual sort of unique culture and history to some degree. It's sort of like a Darwinian scenario here, and they have their affinities and their historical differences. Basically the events of the last 10 years have essentially shaken the mix and added new ingredients. It's a real dilemma.
On that pessimistic note, unless you have something you would want to add as a last-minute thought, I'm afraid we just simply run out of time. Time's not our friend, even though we could have gone on for much longer. Is there anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would appeal to for international aid to the victims in Eastern Libya, because I think that's at the moment that is a truly horrific situation that requires assistance, and we can provide it. I mean,
Ethan, thank you for a fascinating conversation. Obviously, Libya is not going away as a more important story than many recognize, and I look forward to having you back on the show. I hope this conversation inspires readers and listeners to get a copy of Ethan's book of Benghazi, A New History of the Fiasco that Pushed America and Its World to the Brink, published by Hachette Books. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to The Turbulent World. The Turbulent World is a reader and listener-supported column and podcast. Voluntary paid subscribers allow me to cover the cost of production and ensure the widest possible distribution. You can subscribe at www.jamesmdorsey.substack.com. Thank you for tuning in today. Best wishes and take care.